like type
Oh,
out
yeah,
an
that
email.
makes sense.
Yeah, it's overwhelming.
Yeah.
We'll circle back.
Everything on the list we have to all right. That's cute. Yeah, it sounds like you would.
Yeah, it just doesn't slide you. I don't know why. I saw it.
Oh, yeah, that was just.
Oh my God.
It was 4 months old. I don't know, I think she was half, I put it on my, I think she was half, we don't have.
Oh, chocolate.
I know she was half golden retriever.
So
All right. Do we have any announcements?
Yeah.
No? Do any of you know where the other half of the class is? A couple things in terms of where we're at and what we're going to be doing the next few days. We're going to try to finish up the institutions lecture today. And then on Thursday, I would like to talk about that Vision Zero thing. It's if you go on Sakai under resources, the very last document is Vision Zero. It's a town of Chapel Hill policy. I think it would be a good practice to just sort of apply some of the stuff that we've been talking about and get you ready for the midterm. I will post a study guide in terms of topics that are potentially going to be on the midterm. And I'll do that before class so that you can look at it and see if you have questions on any of the stuff, and you can ask me questions after we do that little activity. And then the midterm on Tuesday, which we will not be in here for. Okay, it's going to be a take home. And then in here for a guest lecture on Thursday, and I will take attendance on Thursday. Any questions on any of that? Okay. I met with a couple of you in office hours, looking at some timelines and where you should be in terms of like papers and that kind of thing. And I know a lot of you are like, what do you mean it's not due for a long time? I haven't even thought about it. But if you're working on it, you should be getting to a point where you're narrowing down on a topic that you can start writing up your problem definition. That's about where you should be. Yeah, and I highly encourage you to talk to TK, talk to Faya. If you have any questions, is this too broad? Is this too narrow? Or if you just want somebody else to hear your ideas and walk you through them, honestly, it's kind of fun for us. And well, I guess I shouldn't speak for other people. but it's fun, it's interesting. It also makes the grading process easier, which is always a good thing for you. Why would somebody from Lake Waccamaw, North Carolina, be calling? Anyone? Okay. But it's always good to meet with whoever's going to be reading your paper before you actually turn it in. It's a good student practice. TK, Faye, y'all have anything to add on that?
Just echo the same point. Narrowing down the policy definition is good, and you feel free to meet with me at any point.
I couldn't hear that at all.
I was just reiterating what you said.
Okay, you're reiterating what I said.
Yep.
Excellent. I think this is where we got to last time. All right, we finished this slide. Okay. Feel free to chime in if you want to. So last time I talked a little bit about there are sort of two paths that we go down to identify sources of fragmentation of power in the United States. And the reason that we're doing this is really focused on being able to use political feasibility as one of your criteria in your paper to understand what the right institution is and then understand what some of the potential barriers may be. So we did federalism last time. And today we're going to talk about separation of powers, checks and balances, and then a couple of specific things about each of the three branches of the United States government. We'll just see how far we get. I almost got through it all in the last class. Separation of powers is really easy, okay? And everybody basically understands it. There's three general functions of government: make law, interpret law, enforce law. I wish I'd put enforce instead of execute. And the basic idea is just that one person or one group of people shouldn't be allowed to do all three, or really any combination of the three. It's super simple, and we take it for granted today, but this was truly a revolutionary concept at the time. Okay, this was based on sort of current political thought around the time of the Constitution, a little bit before, people like Montesquieu, who had this to say about it. There would be an end of everything. It's a little hyperbolic, maybe, but that was the general thinking. Super anti-monarchy, right, trying to separate out these functions. And in doing so, fragmenting power. Okay. Separation of powers at the Constitutional Convention was not a controversial topic. Even though it was new, everyone there was pretty much on board with it. What they weren't necessarily on board with is what we call checks and balances. So this is a separate doctrine related to separation of powers that has to do with the degree of separation of those powers. Okay, we have a decent number of checks, okay, where one branch of the government can sort of thwart what another branch of government is trying to do. And you know what the sort of main examples are, right? But the idea of checks and balances was very controversial. Because we have these things, we have what's known as a weak separation of powers state. Montesquieu and those guys, they didn't like checks and balances. They thought it should just be a clean cut in between. And checks and balances, from our perspective, further fragments power, further develops barriers to getting policy change done, right? Because not only does it have to get through Congress, but it has to get through the Supreme Court. And it is important to understand that not all of these things are actually contained in the Constitution. The Supreme Court's ability to declare an act of Congress to be unconstitutional, or to declare an act, executive order or something that the president does to be unconstitutional, or something that the state of North Carolina does to be unconstitutional, that is not in the Constitution itself. Remember, we talked about this idea of inherent powers. And John Marshall and other people on the Supreme Court, Marbury versus Madison, started the dice rolling with this ability of the Supreme Court to act as a check and balance on other branches of government, and in fact on other layers of government when you start thinking about federalism. Now, most of the historical record indicates that the idea of this judicial check was just kind of assumed. It really wasn't that controversial. They just didn't happen to write it into the Constitution. And Chief Justice Marshall was there at the convention. But it is a huge check, and it does bring into play the Supreme Court as a roughly sort of co-equal branch of government, despite what some people say about it being the weakest branch. Okay, so we've got these three things, and we've got different branches who are supposed to do each one of them. Well, what happens when in a two-party system that we have, those branches are controlled by different parties? That could be potentially problematic. And the real sort of threat is that nothing gets done, because we have all these veto points built in. If you have Democrats in control of the White House, Republicans in control of Congress, conservatives in control of the Supreme Court, they're never going to all agree. And so no policy really gets made. In actuality, there's sort of three potential outcomes. And I'll point out, and then I'll give you some data on this. It seems like American voters actually like divided government. They don't like it as much when one party is in full authority, which is interesting. When you think about what these potential outcomes are, the first one is that they actually sit down and talk to each other and maybe come to some kind of agreement. That's obviously ideal. Not in terms of one party getting exactly what they want, but in terms of something getting done. And it's mostly ideal given what the other two potential outcomes are. Complete breakdown. Just everyone kind of runs willy-nilly and the Constitution goes away, or we try to replace it, right? But just think of complete meltdown. Stand by Stephen King. Randall Flagg. Okay. I mean, I'm making jokes, but this isn't like a remote possibility. There have been calls for new constitutional conventions in the last 10, 20 years. None of them were ever taken that seriously, but especially when Obama was in power, there were lots and lots of them. And sometimes they wanted to completely overhaul the Constitution. Sometimes they just wanted to change, one or two things. But anytime you get people questioning the legitimacy of the system itself, that's bad from a policy-making point of view, because you're not really going to be able to get anything done. And especially when you take the big picture approach that we do in terms of maximizing social welfare, right? You're not maximizing the welfare of people who believe one thing or another thing. Then we need the system to operate. The third thing, and I wish I could remember actually which book I got this term out of, crisis and governability. It's sort of an awkward phrase, but I think captures what you see a lot of times, which is in those realms where one branch of government feels like they have clear power, then they use it to do whatever they want. And then when things go poorly, or it's outside of their role, like outside of their jurisdiction, then they just sort of blame and harass everyone else. So if you think about President Obama, you know, he was simply unable to get Congress to do anything on immigration. And immigration is something that is clearly within the purview of Congress. It's one of those 17 things in Article 1, Section 8. So when Congress didn't do that, President Obama did what he could, which was DACA. Everybody know what that is? Deferred Action on Childhood Arrivals. I'm just waiting for the year when it's like too old of an example, you know? But because of the way Congress delegated authority to the president in the original INS Act, it was clear that President Obama has very, very wide discretion in how he chooses to enforce immigration laws. So he took that limited power that he had and he did what he could. And then he blamed Congress for not doing anything else. And then other people just blamed him for what he did. That's the harassment part of this, right? It makes you feel really, really good thoughts about our politicians. Upstanding characters. But, you know, clearly I feel like we've been operating in this zone for a long time in the United States. And this is not a good place to be. You know, we want to be up here in terms of long-term stability, and especially in terms of actually passing, implementing good public policy. We have to be up here. So here's the data I promised. This is the House, this is the Senate, and the middle is the White House. You can see over most of this time period, there's very few solid colors going all the way from the bottom to the top. And that means that we're in a situation of divided government. And especially recently, when there have been times of it, here, right, here, where we are right now, immediately after one of these things changes. And there's a very, very high likelihood that one of these two is going to go red the next time they update this graph. Yeah. So that shows you that it seems like voters want a government that's in that accommodation compromise mode. Yeah. And yet, it doesn't seem our government can get there. And so we'll have to figure out why that is. Of course, if we figure it out, then we're all going to be really famous and make lots of money, and all that kind of stuff. Any questions? All right, so let's think about the reverse scenario when one party does have full control. And what we want to think about is, what does policy making look like? And you have to keep in mind historical context for all of these things. It's not going to be the same at all points in history, but in general, when there is full authority, one of the major factors that goes into decision making, especially decision making on what to do early on, right? Soon after an election. You always hear the first 100 days, or something like that. Well, the reason why they want to do stuff in the first 100 days is they want to get it kind of in the ground as early as possible so that it can start to grow and people start to depend on it. Interests develop around it. Institutions develop around it. Well, if that happens, then it gets very, very hard to dig it back up. So that's what I mean by the power to entrench. If you think about, a lot of policy making, like the Affordable Care Act, that's what they were trying to do. Is they were trying to get that passed early on to get the institutions and the interest built up around it so that hopefully it would survive the inevitable backlash in 2 years. Now, it didn't work. I mean, it worked a little bit, but that's largely because of the way it was structured, which doesn't really matter. But so you see these short bursts of activity, often followed by a holding pattern, because they don't really want to do anything when it gets too close to an election. They try to focus on something that's going to last. So if I go back to the Affordable Care Act, I think one of the main reasons why it hasn't fully stuck around, why they were able to dig up substantial chunks of it, right, is that it didn't really change the structure of how we get healthcare, of how we get access to healthcare. Right? It maintained a focus on private insurance markets. They didn't go for the public option. And so there wasn't necessarily a lot of structural change, which then meant it was possible to chip away at it. But in general, you want to do something that's really going to get dug down deep. Oftentimes, you'll see symbolic policies, things that they know won't survive the next round of elections, for which they promise their constituents, right? Or that it's just something near and dear to their hearts. And sometimes things, we had this discussion in the last class, things like the Affordable Care Act almost become symbolic policies because they do fail to get fully entrenched. And you can compare that with, say, generally our welfare state. Right? In the 60s, when we first started passing laws that provided things like Medicaid and cash welfare and whatever, those programs were around for a fairly long time, and they built up very, very strong foundations and interests. When Ronald Reagan was elected president, his main goal was essentially to dismantle the welfare state. And he failed miserably. I'm not saying there weren't certain successes, there were. But in general, he couldn't do it. Neither could Margaret Thatcher in the UK. And the reason is that those things were entrenched. That's an example of the types of policies that you sort of want to see get put in. Another thing that happens is that they have a tendency to try to expand power in those branches that are less likely to switch after the next election. So clearly this means like the presidency. Since the presidency, you at least get 4 years. With the House, with the Senate, it could change every 2 years. Right? Since even though senators are elected for 6 years, a third of them are up for re-election every 2 years. So this is one reason why you've seen an expansion of power in the executive branch over the last 50 or 60 years. And it's really only one reason. It's also because there are people who are in power who wanted to see an expansion of executive authority. It's called unitary executive theory. If anybody wants to check it out. Yeah. But so, you've seen this, and, it's not just one party that does it either. Very few presidents enjoyed the expansion of executive power more than Barack Obama. Any questions on this? Okay. Let's take a little breather. Got something fun to talk about. Anybody running the Shamrocks 5K this weekend? Anybody even know what that is? You do? Are you a KD?
Yes.
I was supposed to run in it.
I actually think I saw your name on the sign up. I was like,
Yeah, I was supposed to run in it, but I got sick and it was like freaking 25 degrees.
yeah.
So I showed up and got my t-shirt and left.
You still pay.
I still paid. It's a fun race.
I heard Orange County Public Schools are not implementing a mask mandate in like 3 days,
Oh, really?
but I don't think that's us.
Orange County Public Schools is separate from Chapel Hill Carborough.
Yeah.
But Wake County just did that.
Do you think they'll do that for us? Like, what are your opinions on that?
I don't think that they'll do it like for y'all sitting in class. They might go to more of an optional one in certain situations. All I want, honestly, is that they tell me that I don't have to wear one when I'm teaching in like a big lecture hall. Because this is terrible. It's just a very different situation, I guess. I don't know. Maybe they'll get rid of it. What do y'all think? Do you want them to get rid of it, or do you like it? Let's see, I just gave you a double-barreled question, right? No matter whether you shook your head or not, it could have gone either way. Yeah.
This is a personal philosophy of mine, but I think there's a lot of like strong say on, oh, we should end masks in class. This is ridiculous. And no, we should wear masks at all times. And if we end mask mandates, everything's going to go to hell. I feel like a lot of people I know, and personally, I'll do whatever they tell me. I really don't care. So,
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like there's a lot of people on campus that will kind of just go with the flow, but they're not the ones that are like making these.
Right.
I've seen a lot of noise made on like both sides, but I feel like a lot of people aren't like on those sides,
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I feel like there's more evidence, right, that shows that, I can't remember what it's actually called, kind of the one-sided mask wearing. So like, say you literally can't get the vaccine. but that if you wear a mask, if you wear a good mask, you're still be protected. I think that if we get a lot more science showing that, I think that's huge in terms of going towards not having a mandate. Saw her first, and I'll get you.
I was gonna say, like, after I met that article that you signed,
Huh?
I think I see the value in like not having it for younger children. And, I think there's something, I think there's some sort of vacation sort of,
Yeah.
and then like, I think there's
Right. What she's saying for people in the back is like, she feels like, you know, there is all this evidence that shows some of the negative impacts on younger children of being masked in school, in terms of learning, in terms of emotional development, and you know, that kind of thing. That's obviously less true, I guess, sort of college age. But I don't know. But look, everybody has to notice when you go around town these days, you go into a gas station, very few people are wearing a mask. I promise you.
I was just.
Okay.
I was gonna say, like, I just read that Raleigh and like Durham, I guess, expires February 25th. And I just like, that makes me think about the people that commute like to and from like, I guess, work every day. Like my dad works in Chapel Hill, but he lives in Raleigh.
Yeah.
So I guess like what, I don't know. I just don't know if like the individual like counties or cities are gonna think about that one or just ignore it.
See, this is getting into like federalism. Right.
So I feel like by state, my sister lives on the border of South Carolina and North Carolina, and the South Carolina one is done, and she kind of notices how like, when she goes between, she's like, what's the point anymore? But then I feel like it gets worse when you go to like counties and cities and stuff, 'cause it's just like.
Yeah. Oh, let me get there and then we'll move on.
I was just gonna say, I think it's gonna be interesting to see what the university might say, just because we do have like the #1 school for public health. So like if we have a decision, it's gonna look really.
Yeah. No, it's true. I find it amusing that we have the #1 school of public health, and yet the school of public health was exactly one of two entities, well, actually really the only entity to say we're going to go remote for the first few weeks. Because even in public policy, it wasn't like full departmental like policy, it was like the default. But it'll be interesting to see if they actually listen. School of public health. Yeah.
I know that NC State like sent something out to their students about like how when their mandate goes away, that they're gonna stop implementing theirs as well.
Oh, really?
Yeah, at least like just to their students is what they've said.
Okay.
So I think that's kind of interesting. I was wondering if you know anything about like the difference between like a county getting rid of their mandates versus like a public university.
It's just different people in power, right? So like the Orange County, like obviously UNC sits within Orange County, but UNC has jurisdiction. So Board of Governors, Board of Trustees, that's who has the real authority. So we can do something different than what the county does. Did you ever hand it to?
Yeah, I was just saying what she was saying about like crossing county lines has been a problem, I think, like throughout, even in the height of the pandemic. I was like driving across a bunch of state lines, and there were states where like there were restaurants that were completely closed down. Like in California, none of the restaurants were open. And then when we were in Texas, it was like we were looked at funny for wearing a mask inside a grocery store.
Well,
there was like totally
just go down to the
opposite
beach.
spectrum. Yeah.
You'll get looked at funny. I was down there not too long ago and having a conversation, and I was the only one in the store with a mask on. And they're like, "Why do you have that mask on?" I'm like, "From Chapel Hill." They're like, "Oh, okay." And then they were totally fine. Like they didn't make fun of me or anything. They're just like, "Oh." Okay. That's cool. Maybe we'll get some kind of decision on it soon. These ones are starting to go out. Okay, let's talk about some specific things with Congress. It is really important to understand that most of the work in Congress gets done at the level of committees. And the reason why I'm stressing this is that this is where most policy goes to die, right, is into committees. So when we're talking about veto points, committees offer a very, very good opportunity to sort of squelch any particular policy change. Each committee has a specialized sort of jurisdiction. Sometimes those are overlapping though. And so bills could go to one or another committee. And this is important because historically, the chairs of the committee, who are appointed by the majority party, right? One of the main reasons why it's a good thing to have a majority in Congress. They have almost full discretion as to what happens to bills, whether they have hearings on them, whether they just go into a desk drawer somewhere and never come out again, who to call as witnesses, all of those types of things. And committee chairs historically had a lot of power. And that's where the specialized committees with overlapping jurisdictions came in, because you could strategically assign a particular bill to a particular committee because you know that the chair there or the people on that committee are more amenable to compromise. Well, what's happened in the last 25 years, maybe 30 years, is that the power has really shifted away from the committee chairs and into the overall leadership of the House and of the Senate. So away from the chairs and to the Speaker of the House, for example. This is important from a policy point of view because it's taking out that ability to choose a committee where you might get some kind of accommodation and compromise. And it's also very reflective of the increase in party loyalty that gets rewarded, and just overall partisanship. You know, it used to be that to become a committee chair, you had to be the most senior member of the majority party on that committee, meaning you've been on there the longest. You know what the hell you're talking about. Yeah, well, that changed. And it became much more about party loyalty, loyalty to the Speaker of the House, right? And, you know, all of that really got going in the mid-1990s. This is one of the few times I ever share personal opinions on things, but the root of all evil, if you want to get right down to it, in terms of American governance over the last 30 years, is Mr. Newt Gingrich, who, as Speaker of the House in 1995, is the one that caused the shifts, that caused a lot of the real partisan bickering, right? To the point where he gave Democrats less money to hire staff than he did Republicans. Don't post that. No. But anyway, it's just changed the whole dynamic of being much more about party than about policy. That's why I bring it up. Another thing, if we care about good policy being made, is that amendments have to be able to be proposed, because amendments are how we're going to compromise. Well, the amendment process depends on the rules, and it differs between the House and the Senate. The House gets a brand new set of rules every time there's a new Congress, so every 2 years. The Senate operates on a continuous basis. So they can change the rules, right? They have a rules committee, but the rules just carry over from one Congress to the next. And so what that means is that in general, historically, there's been a lot more continuity in the amendment process in the Senate, which is also supposed to be more of a collegial body. Yeah. But it's also the home of the filibuster. Hopefully you all know what the filibuster is, but it is important to understand the process that under Senate rules, and it's Senate rules, it's not the Constitution. Under Senate rules, they have the right to unlimited debate. And they used to actually have to talk. Like they would have to just keep on talking. Which is why Senator Byrd read the phone book. Ted Cruz read Green Eggs and Ham. You know, all that kind of fun trivia. In order to stop debate, somebody has to file a motion for cloture, to close debate. And for that motion to pass, you need 60 votes. So that's why with the filibuster, if you use it all the time, the Senate essentially becomes a 60-vote majority body. Filibuster wasn't meant to be used that often. It was meant as a small means of leverage for the minority party to block those things that they found particularly loathsome, and to use it as a bargaining chip. Unfortunately, what happened was it started getting abused. And anytime they didn't like something, and really anytime the other party looked like they were going to be successful in achieving one of their campaign goals, it got filibustered. And so long as the numbers are such that you have a filibuster-proof majority, then nothing ever gets done. And so what's happened is they've gone in and basically gotten rid of the filibuster on everything except for basic legislation. So just to show you a little bit of data here. So these are filibusters. You can't even hardly see the lines down here. It happens so rarely. Then it starts getting a little bit more, a little bit more. 1995, anybody know what happened in 1995? Newt Gingrich became Speaker of the House. Bam, bam, bam. Okay. So, you know, it's one of those things, I think, it's a classic example of something that served good when it comes to enacting good policy that got abused to the point where it's just basically gone. And there's some details as to when that happened, if you were so inclined. Questions, comments? So last time I talked about the fact that there's no direct democracy at the federal level, that all the democracy that we have is representative in nature. So I think it's useful to know, well, how representative are these people? And I'm only giving you some data points here. There's a whole lot more that you can look at. But, you know, I think if you just look at basic numbers like gender breakdown, it's clearly not representative. what does that mean? I don't really know. You know, other than it seems like there's a whole lot of people that aren't, whose interests aren't being, you know, represented in Congress. And the whole notion of a representative democracy is exactly that. One of the most interesting sort of demographic things when it comes to Congress is actually religion. Out of the 535, 538 members of Congress, I think that there are 2 who do not self-identify with any particular religion, which is actually the fastest growing religion in the United States. So you're talking about 35% of the population as being not religiously affiliated, and 2 out of 530 some, you know, people. That's clearly not representative. One thing to look at here too, when you're thinking about political feasibility, Senate is 50-50. The House is very close to 50-50. And that's why, you know, when it comes to this November, you might see a switch away from this full authority and into divided government again. Here's the party makeup. It is very much a coastal blue scenario. You know, which is important when you're thinking about a national government. It's difficult to truly represent everybody's interests and have everybody's interests, everybody's social welfare be maximized. But if these people aren't talking to these people, then we're screwed. All right. So we've talked a little bit about how individuals make decisions, how they make decisions in a group context. Well, how do members of Congress make decisions about policy? So the overwhelming consensus, sort of in the poli-sci literature, comes from David Mayhew, who says that the primary goal, doesn't mean that there aren't other goals. The primary goal is re-election. And from a representativeness point of view, that's not a bad thing. Because if they are representing their constituents, then theoretically their constituents will vote to re-elect them. It becomes problematic when we have such low voter turnout and elections become a little bit more about money than about actual representation. If anybody can convince me that it's a good idea for me to be able to contribute to a House race in California, I will give you an A for the course. But so, you know, it really comes down to re-election, and the problem that we face is what it takes to get reelected. Is it representing your constituents, or is it representing some other section of society? When it comes to getting reelected, the evidence is very clear that it's better to avoid bad stuff. You don't want anybody to be able to blame you for something. It's nice to be able to claim credit for good stuff, but it's not nearly as effective. And that's all, that all feeds into this like unilateral action harassment, right? Everybody trying to throw blame on somebody else. We also know that there is a current crisis of factual awareness that we have to actually think about. I can't believe that I have to put facts in quotation marks. But it seems like we're doing a lot of arguing past each other, because what we're doing is arguing over values and not facts, but we won't admit it to anyone. So that makes decision-making largely based on ideology. And the last one I have up here, again, just because I'm a fan of political history and policy history. Does anybody know what log rolling means? Like, it's not like rolling on a log in a lake. It just means trading votes. So, it used to be that, a senator who really just didn't care all that much about one thing, but cared a lot about something else, would go to a senator from the other party and be like, dude, if you vote for my thing, I'll vote for your thing. And lo and behold, they would actually do it. You actually even see this in the Supreme Court. The way the Supreme Court decides whether or not to hear a particular case is you need 4 justices to say yes. And there's a lot of evidence, not a lot, there's enough evidence to show that this log rolling, this trading votes happens at that level in the Supreme Court. In fact, when they vote on whether or not to accept a particular case, it's not a yes or no decision. They have 3 options. It's yes, no, and if 3. So they're basically saying, if 3 other people care about this enough to hear the case, fine. I'll do it. Again, trading votes is becoming less and less common. And a lot of it has to do with this ideological purity, party loyalty stuff. Hanging in? Talk a little bit about the president or the executive, whatever. Important to understand that especially in domestic situations, oftentimes the president's most important power is that of persuasion. Being able to talk Congress into doing things, being able to talk the American public into supporting certain things. They don't have a whole lot of direct control, which is amusing because whenever there's an election, right, they're going to lower gas prices and get rid of all taxes. But guess what? They can't. So this ability to persuade can be very, very important. They do have a lot more power in foreign affairs. And that goes back to this idea of sort of presenting a single face in foreign affairs. They also have a lot more power in crisis situations, wartime, other times of crisis. 9/11, George W. Bush got a lot more power, a lot more sort of leeway than he would have traditionally. This is why presidents often use the language of crisis, war on poverty, war on drugs, that kind of thing, trying to expand their power. Where they do have some decent policy authority on domestic affairs in the U.S. Is through their control of executive agencies. Administrative agencies, bureaucracies, sort of use those terms interchangeably. But it's important to realize that their authority there is not coming from the Constitution itself. Their authority is coming from Congress. And Congress can change that authority. Because, what happens is Congress creates the Environmental Protection Agency. It gives them a mandate of sorts, and then it lets them go do their thing. Congress can change that mandate. One thing Congress can't do is like veto administrative action. It's called an administrative veto, and the Supreme Court said they can't do that. Once they delegate the authority, they can't just try to override it. I will tell you that in practice, that stuff happens all the time. And there's no real reason why it shouldn't. From a policy point of view, it's actually incredibly useful. But that has been one of the real expansions of presidential power, has been through administrative agencies. And we'll talk more about those in just a minute. So what are some specific policy tools that the president uses? Well, everyone knows about executive orders. Just remember that they have to have the constitutional authority to issue those orders in the first place. I think I gave you this example, but an executive order legalizing weed doesn't work. They have the pardon power, although it's generally looked down upon as some sort of trading device. Party loyalty. President is the head of their party. The way the parties are set up. Direct appeals to the public. I can't remember the last time I actually heard Biden talk, let alone make a direct appeal to the public. I know he did recently. I'm making a joke, but go ahead.
I was about to say there's one that ended like 10 minutes ago.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Look,
About Russia.
Oh, about Russia. Yeah, well, good for him. It's clearly not a strength of his. Right. And, unfortunately, he was paired with Obama, who was the master at the direct appeals to the public. But that's not Biden's forte. Okay. I do want to talk a little bit about vetoes. Everybody knows the basics of the veto, right? You can veto a law of Congress as presented to them. Congress then can override the veto with 2/3 majority in both houses. Lots of times people get a little bit confused about the line item veto. There is no line item veto at the federal level. The Supreme Court said it's a violation of the presentment clause of the Constitution, and so you can't do it. Almost every state, though, has a line item veto. And again, it's like an administrative veto. It's an incredibly useful tool when it comes to actually getting shit done, because you can just take out the offensive parts and you still have other things that are getting done. Administrative rulemaking, that's just the regulations and such that agencies put out. So why do we have all these bureaucracies, all these agencies? I think it's really important to understand, one is, we honestly, as human beings, we haven't come up with a better way to organize things. I'm not saying one doesn't exist. I'm just saying we haven't come up with it yet. But there's some other things that I want you to be aware of. Administrative agencies at the federal level really started growing in strength under Teddy Roosevelt, who had a very, very strong belief in what he called scientific rulemaking or scientific governance. This idea that experts, people who know what they're talking about in particular fields, make the decisions. So it really did reflect an effort to make good public policy. Now, whether or not that's still true, we can argue about it all day long. But it's certainly there. Agencies are also a very good way for members of Congress to avoid blame, because they can take that little portion of power, give it to Congress, give it to the agency. When the agency does something that makes their constituents mad, they can say, I didn't do it, right? And so that's why you're seeing, have seen historically in the last 40, 50 years, more and more administrative rulemaking as Congress is just more and more trying to avoid blame on either side. This is just a nerd opportunity for you. If you want to check out all the bureaucracies that we have at the federal level, I think you will be amazed and it will be worth your time. But I'm not going to make you sit through it in class. But there's a list right here. One of the, what I think, one of the truly good uses of Wikipedia. For those of you who are true nerds, there's also a list of defunct agencies. The agencies that used to exist that no longer exist. There are some doozies in there. My personal favorite is the Board of Tea Appeals. So it literally had a commission of people that would taste tea that was imported into the United States. I think sounds good. Yeah.
It was only abolished in 1996.
I know. It was only abolished in 1996. I absolutely love that fact. And guess who was Speaker of House at the time? Told you, took away everything good. All right. Any other questions right now?
Do you think that in like the next 10 years, party representation will become like, I guess, more equitable? So we have like younger people and more minorities in office?
I mean, as opposed to all these old people?
Yeah.
Well, I think we're seeing that already. I don't necessarily see it as a good thing. I think that there's a balancing that needs to be done between young and old, experience, fresh ideas. I think actually the huge influx of new members of Congress over the last 6, 8, 10 years is one of the problems that's preventing Congress from doing a whole lot because they have a tendency to be much more ideologically focused. Yeah. Question. You know, I did forget to tell y'all something really important. Today is 2/22/22. It's also my daughter's 18th birthday. Yeah. And the funny thing is, my wife and I talked about this on the day that she was born. That she was going to turn 18 on 2/22/22. Didn't know at the time it was going to be a Tuesday. Makes it even better. Two 2/22 is also a Tuesday. For her birthday, we surprised her and we flew her girlfriend in from Massachusetts. It's a ridiculously cute video. Yeah. Maybe I'll show you at some point. Jay's out there talking about young people and representation, and so it got me thinking. In fact, my daughter now can vote. I'm old enough to be the parent of somebody who can vote. Anyways, okay. Talked about this a little bit. The way delegation works. But I just want to emphasize the importance of the initial legislation that Congress passes that creates the agency. Because that is what the court looks to when determining whether something is legal or not, that the president does. If you go back to President Obama and DACA, okay, one of the reason he was able to do that was because the original enabling legislation just delegated so much discretionary authority. Now, but it's going to differ from agency to agency, from issue to issue, and so it's something you have to figure out. The president does appoint the political heads of the agencies, but the vast majority of people who are working there are civil servants. They don't change from administration to administration, except under the last administration. And typically, we think of the experts, the scientists that Roosevelt liked, as being a part of the civil servant class, I guess. Works. We're having some issues in terms of actually getting them to stick around lately, in large part due to the fact that the political heads have largely taken over. And any kind of actual final decision is done for political reasons instead of scientific reasons. And that's obviously a big problem when it comes to good policy. I don't really care if you know the real details of this, but it is important to understand this bottom one down here, right? When we're talking about policy tools, agencies both regulate and provide direct services. And they generally have a pretty high level of discretion, at least at the sort of top. We'll talk a little bit next time. I'll give you some stories that I have that I think are pretty good about discretion at the bottom. But I don't have it in me right now to tell those stories. But you're talking about hierarchy, you're talking about strict internal rules, all the reasons why we hate going to the DMV. But again, remember, we have not come up with a better way of organizing lots of people with a single or even complex purpose. So there's several different sort of policy tools that you see. The ones I want to talk about in more detail are the adjudicatory decisions, because a lot of people aren't familiar with that. And then these actions by line bureaucrats. Just to give you a little teaser, right? Adjudicatory decisions, every agency that provides some kind of service or benefit, they actually have court-like structures built into them, like immigration courts. And you have to use those structures before you can go into a real court. So even things like getting Social Security disability, like, right, if you get denied, you have to go through these administrative courts. It takes a while, get a decision, and then you can go into the regular courts. But I used to work in immigration court, so I can give you some interesting examples there. I also have a good story about the DMV. You'll have to wait for it. Anybody have any final questions? Anybody else notice that the bell tower seems to be a little bit off? Yeah. What's up with that? going to come back with an answer next time. That would work. Yeah, I hope not. All right, everybody have a good rest of your afternoon. I'm going to go home and make dinner for my daughter. But then the final there is no line.
Yeah.
The federal law. States have different constitutions. Oh. Got it. Yeah, yeah, thank you. Sure.
You were.
Yes. Sorry. Please do. Yeah.
Regarding the examine accommodations, is it like open all day?
It's open.
Okay, so I don't need to do it.
Yeah. I don't think if you time, open at 9, just do it.
So there's not any time limits?
No.
Okay. That's fine.
Okay.
Thank you.
Hi.
I just want to thank you for going over this stuff. We never learned about this in
Oh.
my school.
Really?
Yeah, actually, one of my like favorite teachers, he was a Chilean teacher, and he like came up and he was the one who taught our like American civics class. So he was like, I'm learning this as you guys are. So it was,
Wow.
yeah, very
Well,
cool.
good. I'm glad. I would feel a little bit bad. So many people just assume that everybody knows it. And it's not actually true.
No, I know so much more about like the Chilean democratic like
Yeah.
system and stuff like that than the American one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's funny.
So I was also wondering for the policy brief, do we need to make it a policy that relates to the US? So can it be like for another country? And so I could just like write the final policy part about how it would work in that other country's institutions. Okay.
Yeah. That's the only real limitation that you have about familiarity there.
Okay,
To be able to write.
okay,
That's it.
sounds good. Thanks so much.
Sure.
Hi, Tia.
How are you?
Good.
How are you?
All right.
At the Tesco?
They worked really well, the great. I got a club out.
Yay!
I was talking to my mom about.
Aw, that's so sweet. I'll see you.